Hello and welcome to the Axiom of the Infinite Unknown. Today's episode is going to be based around, a situational assessment on Hong Kong and what's going on there. Our aim is to try and provide some kind of an overview of what's happening there. In the show notes for the episode, we'll include links to future articles and resources that may be useful if anyone else is interested to follow it. But just to get going, before I hand it over to James, to kind of give a timeline of the protests and the way things have gone there of late, just to give an overview on what's the deal with Hong Kong, from what makes it different to the mainland China. So just from an overview perspective, Hong Kong has been separate to the mainland, and basically it was run as a British colony from 1842, just after the first Opium War, and then it was handed back over in 1997. Basically, a lot of we might get into this, but colonialism and imperialism those words are often used as synonyms almost for oppression and horror, and basically often associated, almost used as insults, and they're used in a bad way. And of course, lots of very bad stuff went on, but it wasn't all bad. And Hong Kong is an example of that, with quite a lot of refugees over the years fleeing to Hong Kong from the mainland to get away from the Communist Party and what they were getting up to. And over a very short period of time, from when the Chinese Communist Party took over in 1949, there was more than 1 million. I have some numbers here on like 1.3 million refugees fleeing. By 1962, I have a research paper here published in the academic journal Asian Survey that showed by 1962 there had been 1,385,000 refugees from the mainland in Hong Kong that had arrived there in that post-war period until then. And then just to give a kind of an example, because a lot of people, I think, in the West, we don't realize the difference that China is a major player on the global stage. And I think we kind of take it for granted that, I suppose, China would be a society like ours, where they do things a little bit differently, because they're involved in all these major treaties and they're obviously a major player economically. But the structure of the government there is totally different. And it's a dictatorship, basically. And a really simplistic way of viewing governments is there's only two types of government. There's the kind of government that if you want to get rid of them and they don't want to go, you can use ballot paper. And then there's the other kind, which is what China is, which your only option to get rid of them if they don't want to go is, unfortunately, bloodshed. And because it's a dictatorship, that's a very simplistic way. And as messy, it was Winston Churchill that said something on the lines of democracy is the worst form of government, with the exception of all other forms of government. And the obvious archetypal example at the moment of the messiness of democracy is the US. And as bad as things are in the US, and as messy as it is, and all the mad shit that's going on there at the moment, it's still a democracy. There's still a separation of powers. There's still, for whatever else people try to do over there and nefarious, whatever election stuff is going on, it's still a democracy with free press, freedom of speech, and all these things that are not in the mainland. So we're going to get into this. One example, a historic example that I wish more people knew about, that demonstrate the horror in Chinese history since the Chinese Communist Party took over, would be Mao's Great Leap Forward famine, where some of the more conservative estimates of deaths from 1959 to 1961, like I have a research paper here published in 2014, or is this one from 2014? I'm not sure the year on this. It might be a 1999 paper from this guy, Professor Vaclav Smil from the University of Winnipeg. And he reckoned that between 1959 and 61 alone, just those 2 years, and this isn't including the Cultural Revolution that took place a few years after that, basically to cover up the shit show. But this was a man-made famine that was driven by Maoist communist economic policies that led to a minimum of 30 million up to 40 million. And some of the estimates in other papers I came across were up to 45 million people died in that 2 year period, as an example, whereas 6 million died in the Holocaust. And this was 14 years after World War II. So that this may very well be the single greatest cause of mortality in human history. And it's not really known about in the West. So that's just to give an example of relatively recent. And Mao, because of the Communist Party propaganda, is still held up as some kind of a hero and this savior character because of the spin on the rhetoric and what went on. And
did you see the lady in Portland who had the Mao on her skirt? She was running for mayor in Portland against Ted Wheeler. But the only way Ted Wheeler could have got re-elected in Portland was
she showed up in a Mao skirt.
In Limerick, in Cork City, where I live, there's I don't know what it is. It's some kind of political party or workers' union thing or something, but it's in the middle of the city, and it's I noticed it's on the 3rd floor of this building on North Main Street. And I just noticed it because I was walking past the other day and the lights happened to be on and it showed. And on the window, the sticker was faces of Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Mao, Lenin, which is these stickers on the window and a big Chinese communist flag. And then on the window, and I was like, what on earth is this place? I'm still have to go. I'll report back once I figure out what it is. But that's maybe the romanticization of extreme left-wing politics is something maybe for a discussion on another day. But just to close off this, to give an example. So there was in 1984 of all years, poetically enough, there was an agreement signed between the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, and the British government called the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And what this was going to basically mean that in 1997, the handover was going to take place. And then Hong Kong was going to be ruled under what's called the one country, two systems approach that would have made it different to the mainland. And a lot of the freedoms that the people in Hong Kong would have been very similar to what we take for granted here in the West, which would have been things like free press, free speech, freedom of public assembly, protection of private property, and there's a form of democracy at least. There was at least some inklings of a sniff of the public's ability to be able to choose and remove its leadership. And most importantly, to keep a track on all of this was going to be rule of law. And in recent, the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, I listened to an interview with him recently, and he had a gas anecdote where he described the difference. So where he was talking to his counterpart, and his counterpart, while he was still there, said to him, why are you always talking about rule of law? Like, we have rule of law too. And Chris Patten said, no, you don't. The difference is ye have rule by law. Rule of law means that when I was a government minister in the UK, if I was being brought to court by a citizen or by an organization or a business for something that me and my department pushed through as a policy, I didn't know if we were going to win or not.
Right.
Whereas ye did, ye know. If someone tries and brings the Chinese Communist Party to court,
that mechanism simply isn't available. And Patton always would say that the ability of any private citizen in Ireland, in the UK, to judicially review a decision that his government has made or his local or her local council has made, or we're taking your back garden to put a new road in. Are you? Okay, well, you go to the courts. That mechanism simply isn't even available in
on the
China,
mainland.
On the mainland.
Yeah.
And Hong Kong, and I think that's a really important point, because the independent judiciary as a function of a core pillar of democracy, of a functioning democracy and separation of powers. And while democracy itself was late getting going in Hong Kong itself, the one thing that Hong Kong always had was a very well-regarded independent judiciary of the highest caliber. And that was a safeguard for the city for commercial disputes, both kind of just locally and across Asia, and also the safeguard against any unruly or kind of undue state interference in people's lives, which didn't tend to transpire, but the safeguard of the independent judiciary was there nonetheless. And it still remains right now, but what's being eroded now is any sort of independent governance. So it was
really an intervention of that very thing that sparked the entire process, because it was the attempted introduction of extradition laws, wasn't it? And so it's for that very reason that they recognized what they had special regarding its comparison to what was available on the mainland. And they knew what it would mean to be extradited to China to face whatever like court system they pretended,
some kangaroo court.
Yeah, exactly that.
There were a couple of quite scary aspects to the provisions of the original extradition laws proposed. One of which was the creation of what historically would have been really just minor offenses into acts essentially of treason or sedition.
Subversion, subversion of government.
And so that could be something as simple as, like, again, posting an article. So I think the protests, yes, originally, the birth out of this realization of the implication of being extradited to the mainland to face some Quango court, where there's not a sniff of a jury or any sort of representation or otherwise. And
99-point-something% successful prosecution rate by the government.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
99.8.
That's so good.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's so brilliant.
Their lawyers are fantastic.
Yeah.
So.
One thing. Can we do a 10-minute late intro?
Yeah, because one thing I didn't
because Alan doesn't. People don't know who Alan is.
Yeah. So where I do that is that. So I'm Kieran O'Regan, James Velitis, of course, and joining us is Alan Flanagan. And the reason that we asked Alan to join us is because of not only his general interest in geopolitics and big questions around associated areas, but also because Alan is a lawyer, worked as a lawyer for years, and has lived in Hong Kong, and seemed to be in the perfect situation to be able to join us to talk about this unbelievably important situation. So
yeah. Glad to be here, lads. We'll tease it all out.
Class. One last thing I wanted to touch on before before handing over to James to kind of take us through, like he'd mentioned there, the protests and what's going on there is just to give one particular kind of case study to show the difference between the kind of crack that can go on underneath the Chinese Communist Party, which is basically, as we said, a government that you cannot remove, that isn't accountable to anyone. That is the Uyghur situation in the Xinjiang province. So it's up to recently has gotten very little attention, unfortunately, but now it seems to be getting more so. But just to give a few bullet points here on the reality of what's going on there with the Uyghur Muslims in the northwestern province. So according to Human Rights Watch, there's at least 1 million of them in camps, which the government officially calls re-education camps. But very many people are calling concentration camps instead. And there's all different types, but that phrase is being used and they're not all the same, but there's some very murky stuff going on there that I'll get to, and how people are ending up there. So this is from a particular September 2020 article in The Guardian. So this is kind of, this is where it starts. The kind of murky stuff going on is in relation to slave labor. So this is a September 2020 article from The Guardian that I'll include in the show notes below. And these are the opening lines. Quote, "Many of the world's biggest fashion brands and retailers are complicit in the forced labor and human rights violations being perpetrated on millions of Uyghur people in the Xinjiang region of northwestern China," says a coalition of more than 180 human rights groups. Close quote. This is where it starts getting more insidious. So we're starting with slavery as the opening act, right? This is a June 2020 BBC article. Quote, opening lines. "China is forcing women to be sterilized," these are the Uyghur women, or fitted with contraceptive devices in Xinjiang in an apparent attempt to limit the population of Muslim Uyghurs, according to new research. The report by China scholar Adrian Zenz has prompted international calls for United Nations to investigate. And then the closing lines from the same article go, Mr. Zen's report characterizes an alleged campaign of coercive birth control in Xinjiang as part of a demographic campaign of genocide against the Uyghurs. And this is a quote from him. These findings provide the strongest evidence yet that Beijing's policies in Xinjiang meet one of the genocide criteria in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So the last bit I'm going to touch on is the most horrific element of this whole thing, which is the 2019 China Tribunal that unfortunately did not get much publicity. This was headed up by Sir Geoffrey Nice, or Nice QC, who actually headed up the War Crimes Tribunal against Slobodan Milosevic. And in its conclusions on this tribunal, this is a quote in relation to genocide. Quote, the tribunal has no doubt whatsoever that physical acts have been carried out that are indicative of the crime of genocide. Close quote. It also went on, it also concluded with the following statement, basically acknowledging that this isn't something that's going on there by private or organizations or private bodies, but this is being, not only is the government aware of it, but the Chinese Communist Party is driving it. Driven by the party. So, quote, the tribunal is certain so as to be sure that attacks have indeed been directed against the Falun Gong and the Uyghurs in the People's Republic of China, with actual knowledge of the attack by state actors of the government in the PRC. So, and this is the last bit I'm going to finish with. Quote, the tribunal is also satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that one or more of the following acts have been committed on the Falun Gong and Uyghurs in the People's Republic of China: murder, extermination, imprisonment, or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law, torture, rape, or any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity, persecution on racial, national, ethnic, cultural, or religious grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law, and enforced disappearance. And what that tribunal was set up for specifically, that's just some of the bullet points, was in relation to forced organ harvestation, where they were basically using Uyghurs and Falun Gong. Yeah, to just, Chinese Communist Party members or people who had enough money were basically able to just get an organ on the day. So they'd just basically take these people off the streets who were tissue matched, these Falun Gong and Uyghurs, and just take their organs, whatever they wanted, a heart, a liver, or kidneys, and just incinerate the body afterwards, gone off the face of the earth. So they're using these people like, I don't even know what do you even call them. It's hard to even, what do you even call that? So that's basically an example of this, like the People's Republic of China, driven and controlled by the Communist Party, is on a different planet to the open societies that we're lucky enough to be able to be living in Ireland or the UK and across the Western world. So that's where we were, as just to give an outline. This is why people are not fucking happy in Hong Kong that the thing that was making them different to the mainland in terms of the legal structure and the political structure is being shredded by the Communist Party. That's why they're very unhappy. And if I was living there, I'd also be very, very, very unhappy about this situation. So there's kind of a lay of the land there, Oscar. So our plan was next to James to take us through a timeline of this particular protest situation.
Yeah, we'll keep it open to sort of conversation. Also, I think did we ever do a podcast on the basically what is a high-tech genocide on the Uyghur people? I think we did it with
Genocide or something, wasn't it?
I thought so, because I have so many notes about it, and I was like, we must have done an episode, because I did a lot of research on it.
The word literal, we'll include in the show notes. It was called, and we did 2 episodes on China as well, episode 4 and 5, and then that one literal. It was something like literal genocide was in the title. It was like metaphorical suicide and literal genocide or something. But
it's also not new. There was a particular area by the harbor in Hong Kong where you would always have Falun Gong members in just completely peaceful. There's no violence in the Falun Gong at all.
Yeah, they just weirded people out, really, didn't they? Because they were like a cult religion thing, and people didn't know what to make of it.
Yeah, it's meditation and Tai Chi.
Yeah, that's what I mean. People just had some sort of mistrust based on the fact that it was like,
I think
it's weird.
Yeah, well, I mean, within China, it's something that's cultural that isn't the state. You know, China have since the Cultural Revolution gone out of their way to just absolutely dismantle and destroy any sort of individuality, any sort of kind of, you know, like not, you know, just religion, but cultural aspects of life, such that the only kind of fulcrum is the CCP itself. And they were always there with these various like posters and illustrations of what was going on in China. And it used to really, really, you know, because like I'm a kid and I'm seeing these like images of organ harvesting, but like, yeah, so that always stuck with me. And the context, though, was obviously absent until I got older and realized that, you know, this is something that's been happening, not even just with a recency, but like a persistent program of persecution. And I think it's important just to tie that all off with the reality that most people around the world view China as like a homogenous bloc. It's China as one country and the Chinese as like a homogenous ethnic group. And that's just not the case at all. You know, it's like saying, you know, that America is just a homogenous bloc and everyone in there is American.
And that's why people get so much wrong about America, because you're talking about so many different countries. You're talking about parts of the South, which are really quite backwards in terms of their, you know, their honor culture. And then you're talking parts of the East where they're far more liberal. And then you've got the West and which is more techie. And you say, yeah, that's why people get so much wrong about countries that they try to pretend that they know anything about, is because they talk about it as though it's one thing.
As if it's one thing. And so, you know, within China, the dominance, the ascendancy is the Han Chinese. Anyone that doesn't fit that ethnic bracket has been viciously persecuted by the CCP since the advent of power of the actual party. And all of this subjugation is laid out in the preamble to the Chinese Constitution, even though in it they describe we, the Chinese people of all ethnic groups. We actually, you know, we know as a point of fact that it's not all ethnic groups. It's like we, the Han Chinese, will do X, Y, and Z.
You need only look at the way in which they're attempting to manage sort of I don't know a better word for it, the Uyghurs, by literally taking Han Chinese people and saying we're setting up almost a buddy system where we will put a Han Chinese person in the home of every Uyghur Muslim family, and for the sake of cultural assimilation. It's like, no, it's because you have the model, the sort of platonic ideal of what a Chinese person is. It's a Han Chinese person, and you're placing them as spies, agents within the homes of Uyghur Muslims, people that you very much don't want to exist in 20 years.
Right. And in those camps, you know, reports out of those camps are that they'll be forced to spend their evenings, you know, practicing singing the Chinese national anthem and stuff. So it's cultural brainwashing and wiping out as well. You know, but I think I'll just read out a quick quote from the preamble to the Chinese Constitution, which I think, you know, if we're talking constitutions as we know them, we typically will read them as, you know, flowery language about democracy and all of this stuff. This is from the preamble of the Chinese Constitution. Quote, The Chinese people and the Chinese Liberation's Army have defeated imperialist and hegemonist aggression, sabotage and armed provocations, safeguarded national independence and security, and strengthened national defense. We, the Chinese people of all ethnic groups, that's the lie, will continue under the leadership of the Communist Party of China and the guidance of Marxist-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, and the theory of three represents, the scientific outlook on development, and Xi Jinping thought on socialism, with Chinese characteristics for a new era, to uphold the people's democratic dictatorship, stay on the socialist road, carry out reform and opening up, steadily improve the socialist institutions, develop the socialist market economy and socialist democracy, improve socialist rule of law. So what you have here is this lineage starting with Marxist-Leninism and ending with what they've called the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era.
That's what you hear a lot, with socialism with Chinese characteristics. You hear this a lot.
And what that is in all of that madness, there's two themes that are really obvious. One is a belligerent view of the rest of the world and an overt pride in the fact that China, really with the exception of Hong Kong, hasn't been, other than what they call the century of shame from the period of the Opium Wars to the occupation by Japan. China has a long and distinguished history of being a superpower in one era or civilization or another. And so this, in many respects, the current behavior of China, I don't think can be divorced from not only that historical role, but also the recent, the century of shame, so to speak. It overtly wants to assert itself in the world in a way that's belligerent and aggressive and completely through the lens of what it sees as its successful prism of kind of socialism and, these characteristics for a new era. So I think their constitution is terrifying, to be honest.
No, I'm really glad you read that, actually. And as well as obviously the century of shame, there's also the three T's about which they perhaps feel even more shame. The censorship on the three T's, Tiananmen, Taiwan, and Tibet. You can't get away with saying out loud any of those words. Because you do risk some sort of a punitive action. There is much to be undiscussed in China.
Take us through that timeline, James, because it's going to be a good refresher.
Yes, sure, because we obviously were talking previously about in February of 2019, they were bringing about these extradition laws, and the Hong Kong people knew what this was indicative of. What they could extrapolate out and see where this was going. And so at the end of March, protests began, and Carrie Lam was very much the face of the Hong Kong facing front of this whole amendment to the law, which obviously included extradition to mainland China. And through April, the protests continue, and Carrie Lam says, we're still backing this, and there were tens of thousands of people protesting. And in June, it got up to like half. There was a day where there were over 500,000 people protesting. There were in June there were 3,000 lawyers who dressed in black to protest the extradition laws, and this is when to deal with the protest now. In June, they started using rubber bullets, and they really started treating them more as though they were riots rather than protests. And through this, Carrie Lam's now starting to weaken her position, and she's saying, we could make concessions on the bill, and people understood this to be too little. It wasn't anywhere near the promise that they needed to hear, that they were going to remain safe. Because you were talking about the introduction of Hong Kong Basic Law during the handover. A part of this, as well as introducing the one country, two systems, was also that basically they would continue their capitalist enterprises through to 2047. So really, this is a conversation that was meant to happen in over a quarter of a century from now. This wasn't meant to be taking place now. But what we've seen is after all of those, after it hit that peak in June, they really did turn into riots in July. And this is when Carrie Lam said the bill's dead. Could you please all calm down? And people at this point, the momentum had built to such a degree that people weren't satisfied with hearing that this particular bill was dead, because they knew what was being signaled, and also they had seen the changes on the streets in the police that they used to trust so much. They've now had these confrontations with authoritarianism, which terrified them enough that they knew that killing this bill wasn't the end to what was coming. And so from there, in August, people start to be charged, protesters start to be charged. Lam actually says in September that she just wants to quit. She literally says publicly, I don't want this job anymore. Can you please can you please let me quit? And she's trying to ease tensions at this point, because I think she said something like, I've destroyed Hong Kong. Like, I'm so sorry. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So she sort of was grasping what had happened. And then it's October. So after this, it's October, and then things step up another gear. This is when an 18-year-old gets shot in the shoulder on the 70th anniversary of the CCP. In that same month, a 14-year-old gets shot in the thigh. That is when Jimmy Sham, who's this LGBT human rights activist, gets beaten by 4 police officers with hammers and knives. I don't even know what it is to be beaten with a knife, but it was the 23rd of October that month that the bill is officially withdrawn. So that's when the bill is officially withdrawn. But like I say, it doesn't quite satisfy the fears. It doesn't quash the concerns that have now grown. And so in November, there was a lot more violence. I think this is when you start to hear that the rioters or the protesters are, they're starting to engage in some pretty horrific activity. One bit the ear of a politician off, and during that time, a protest was ushered in a parking lot, and a 22-year-old fell off the 3rd floor, hit the 2nd floor, and a couple of days later he died in hospital. That was the first death somehow that we know of in the Hong Kong protests. So that was the first time that officially somebody had died. And then November 11th, the police start firing live rounds. And so it really just spirals out of control. Then obviously, so you're getting into November now, and now you can imagine the fact that when we're inching closer and closer to what is about to be a pandemic, and things are naturally dying off, and also it's reached this stalemate because protesters are no longer making any progress. And the police aren't getting any ground either, and the police are actually figuring out how to. It was really with that parking lot incident that they started to figure out how to suppress these movements, and they got a lot better at suppressing them. So then it sort of died off, and then we get into 2020, and you can pretty much skip forward until summertime or just before springtime, where in April you have 15 arrests, which include Martin Lee and Jimmy Lai. Those are the 2 notable ones. And then in May the 28th, that's when we have the national security law introduced to suppress protests. It basically removes the ability of free expression. It does so much damage. and now protesters are legitimately scared of.
Right.
They could walk out their door and they know they're risking being arrested and disappeared, and
it's crimes like, you know, sedition, stuff that sounds like it's Orwellian in terms of the nature of the crimes. Sedition, succession, inciting foreign interference in internal Hong Kong Chinese affairs. It essentially means that someone can be charged literally with, as in one case during the summer, an 11-year-old girl, was arrested for having the old Hong Kong British colonial flag around her shoulders at a protest that was peaceful. You have an 11-year-old girl arrested, and on the basis that act was seditious. So it's a nefarious law, and since the day after comes in May 28th, since as of May 29th this year, you've had nearly 1,800 people charged with taking part. You've had 1,500 are facing prosecution. They're awaiting trial. You've had 5,500 are on bail pending further investigation. The oldest is 84. The youngest is 11. Of that group, 2,500 are women. So the idea that this has, you know, kind of come into effect, but people kind of thought, oh, well, you know, it won't really be applied. It's been applied from day one. These are huge numbers of people that have been arrested and tried.
That's entirely why it was brought about. And it's basically what it basically is. These protests served almost as unfortunately, as a catalyst for what was happening anyway. And it just sped up the process of, instead of 2047, it turned out to be, you know, May 28th of 2020.
I think that would be good to come back to. It's just for people listening. So this 2047, the agreement, the Sino-British Joint Declaration 1984 was essentially a compromise with Deng Xiaoping, at the time the Chinese premier, and it was Deng Xiaoping who kind of agreed, or came up certainly even with the slogan "One Country, Two Systems." But the idea was that upon the handover in 1997, which was happening one way or the other, that Hong Kong would continue as what's known as a special administrative region. So it would be back as part of China, but it would conduct itself as the Hong Kong SAR, the Special Administrative Region. And that is the agreement that was supposed to stay in place unfettered until 2047, that Hong Kong was essentially to rule itself autonomously, and that by 2047 there would be a review. But there was no inclination that the review would even result in Hong Kong being subsumed into China. And at the time of the handover, and even leading up to that, much of the kind of optimism was for Hong Kong's future, for many reasons, as the financial hub and otherwise, but largely because people didn't really think that it would be in China's interests in any real way to pull it into the fold. The scare happened back in 2016, and you could almost maybe consider this a preliminary, almost a prelude maybe to what subsequently transpired. But China flexed its muscles back in 2016 by implying that it was going to dictate who was running for the elections. So the elections, they said, the election will still be an election, as in there'll be vote, but we're going to choose the candidates. And there was civil unrest at that time. There was some gathering, civil protests, not necessarily violent, but enough to, and China just backed down. And a lot of people felt that it was just a kind of remember who's boss and a bit of a flex of the bicep. But I think if we look at that now, we can kind of see that that was really the start of them starting to push a few boundaries with Hong Kong. And just to give people a sense of the strength of what was envisaged by this one country, two systems, the Hong Kong Basic Law was essentially the Hong Kong Constitution. And that came in. And within that, you had the guarantee of, this is from the Hong Kong Basic Law, Article 19. The Hong Kong Special Administrative Region shall be vested with independent judicial power, including that of final adjudication. So that means even that the Court of Highest Appeal stays in Hong Kong. You don't go to the mainland. Article 27, Hong Kong residents shall have freedom of speech, of the press, of publication, of association, of assembly, of procession, of demonstration, the right and freedom to join and form trade unions and to strike. The freedom of the person of Hong Kong residents shall be inviolable. No Hong Kong resident shall be subject to arbitrary, unlawful arrest, detention, imprisonment. Article 31, Hong Kong residents shall have freedom of movement, freedom of emigration, freedom to travel, enter or leave the region. Unless restrained by law, holders of valid travel documents shall be free to leave the region without special authorization. And then most importantly, Article 35, Hong Kong residents shall have the right to confidential legal advice, access to the courts, choice of lawyers for timely protection of their lawful rights and interests. Hong Kong residents shall have the right to institute legal proceedings in the courts against the acts of the executive authorities and their personnel. So that's judicial review, a principle that we hold dear as democracy. So what you have here isn't just a token gesture of you'll be a bit freer than people on the mainland. This is a democratic constitution guaranteeing all of the rights that we enjoy of freedom of press and the assembly, but even the structural aspects of the democracy in terms of an independent judiciary, the right to take your government to court if you feel they're infringing with your rights, and these factors. So it was a democratic constitution. But Hong Kong's institutions have been, unfortunately, quite weak in the face of that. And I think that is something that the history books and by Chris Patten's own admission, the former governor of Hong Kong, they didn't get Hong Kong democracy going until quite late. The first open elections weren't until, the 90s. China delayed that. And Chris Patten's book on his governorship of Hong Kong is quite illuminating from the basic law, from the Joint Declaration onwards in 1984. China were a bad faith actor at every step of the proceedings. And that's quite clear. So in many respects, their conduct now is nothing new. They've been a belligerent, bad faith actor in relation to Hong Kong from the get-go, deliberately delaying the ability of the British at the time to set up LegCo, the Legislative Council, to get the first free elections run, to get a democratic body in place to allow them time to strengthen so that when pressure came on from Beijing, there was some degree of institutional integrity and structure to withstand some pressure. What you ended up having was Carrie Lam, who just was a Beijing stooge and folded under the first sign of any sort of scrutiny from Beijing.
Yeah, no, sorry, go on.
Oh, just to pick up on a few points that you made there. There's some kind of points of relevance here in terms of timeline that I think are really interesting. And in terms of how these basically what are massive events have somewhat gone under the radar in Hong Kong because of what we've been preoccupied with here in the West. So you mentioned there in particular, James, May 28th. Well, it was May 25th that George Floyd died. Only a few days before. And May 20, so it's only 3 days. So, and then throughout that whole month of June is when they started really bringing in a load of these arrests and all sorts of, the more riots and protests and stuff happened, but there were it didn't make it to our media because the Western media was caught up with the mayhem that was going on in the US at the time. And then obviously of late, look at the way that the Western media is in the whole world, but the Western media in particular is caught up with the US elections preamble and the ongoing stuff over there, but the preamble. And then think about the way that Britain are caught up coming into this Brexit deadline with no deal made yet. And so then you have the very people that are you have Macron is under pressure for, basically he's under pressure, a lot of political pressure for these new laws he's after bringing in, these that kind of anti-Islamic extremist stuff they're after bringing in, this big speech he made, and he does
really respectable. Actually, I found it's the most I've ever liked Macron. Like,
yeah,
a lot.
It was a really powerful speech. But like all this stuff is happening here, so like the people, there's all this stuff happening in the West that is because it's almost like there's the only way you can think of it just like as the default in human civilization has not been liberal open societies.
Right.
It hasn't been the default. That's a modern invention that spawned since basically the Enlightenment, kind of the glorious revolution in the UK and in England.
Well, the best way to understand it is, Homo sapiens, like 200,000 years. Yeah, it's not as though for 200,000 years Homo sapiens were like, I really don't want to make progress. I'd hate to make progress. I'd hate if next year was better than this year, and yet, despite the fact that they clearly would have wanted better lives, they failed to do so systematically for almost 200,000 years, until in what is basically at the blink of an eye in terms of just even human history, let alone world history, we suddenly unlocked an ability to actually make our lives better. And a lot of that has to do with the Enlightenment movement and what was born out of that. And in regards to China, aren't blind to monopolizing on the way in which the West is not only obsessed with itself, but also self-immolating in instinct. It's because you're seeing public statements from the CCP saying the US is an inherently racist society where they mistreat black people and they're still living no better than slaves. These are statements coming out from China right now because they know what they're doing. They're taking what basically is being handed to them on a platter, and they're going, thank you so much, because now we get to make you look like the bad guys because you think you are the bad guys, you absolute morons.
Right. I think you're right. I think there's a combination of factors. I think there's part of it being kind of through no fault of anyone's. There's only so much emotional capital people have to invest in various issues, and it's been a pretty crazy year, right? So in a year where there's a lot of upheaval and where our bias in the West is to America, like people don't sit down and watch Hong Kong sitcoms or Hong Kong television or follow Hong Kong bands, and so our orbit culturally is around America, is around the West. I mean, Americans are even perplexed at how much interest Europeans take in their election. I'm just like, does this surprise you? But so I think there's that element, which is just the fact that, this is a geographic and cultural bias that people will have to what they pay attention to. And Hong Kong's not really going to be on their radar unless they've maybe traveled there or have a big interest in geopolitics or used to live there. Or live there right now. So that there's that. And then I think there's the other aspect of maybe the more deliberate part, which I find a bit nefarious, which is this kind of romanticism with Maoism, with communism amongst what tends to be, wealthy white middle-class kids, waxing lyrical about some glorious Marxist revolution that they want to see happening. So I think that there's that plays into a bias where they would be intrinsically more critical of Western culture and society than they would of China. And they're happy to sweep any of the darkest aspects of the current regime in China, whether it's the Uyghur and the Falun Gong concentration camps or simply their conduct in foreign policy,
Well, they're willing to overlook Stalin's misbehaviors.
Right.
Like this is, I know I'm not going to make any friends by saying this right now amongst you two, but this is very much, you know, Chomskyite politics. It's very much a heralding of the Che Guevaras and these far left figures elsewhere, and a purposeful blind eye to what the realities are on the ground. And it's, you know, it's born out of that same far left politics that carried through, modernized and perpetuated perhaps stronger than it ever has been. So
right. I think there's a romanticism to that. Yes. I think there's the ideological kind of hangover of the Frankfurt School in kind of, I guess, philosophical circles, so to speak. And there has been a precedent for this. I think you're right in terms of people in Europe who were Marxists, socialists, or communists were more than willing to sweep the worst excesses of the Soviet regime under the rug. You know, but we'll continue to bang on about fascism, for example, you know, and create this false lack of equivalency. You know, we're usually concerned with false equivalence. In this case, it's actually the opposite. You know, it's kind of engineering one high evil, you know, that typified all that was wrong with the world, and let, you know, kind of the other one scamper off and get away with any sort of historical scrutiny. I think there's that. I think there's the reality that as well, China just do a good job of, you know, this stuff isn't really that easy to find. Even you have to be interested in this stuff to go digging, to go find that there are concentration camps in China in 2020, that there is this level of persecution, that there are ethnic groups within China for whom the Han want to simply wipe out from the face of the planet. So
you barely even hear anything about the social credit system or any of these sorts of this whole scheme that's going on in big provinces in China that you barely hear about it. But it's this massive technological panopticon of sort of dictatorial control that is just currently in process, and you need to dive into some of the most obscure of articles to actually get a sense of what's actually happening.
Yeah. So that, you know, that ability of a regime, and this is a characteristic of autocratic, authoritarian dictatorships, is the ability to control the stream of information that go. I mean, the most famous historical example of this would be Germany hosting the 1936 Olympics and being like, look how wonderful our society is. And everyone's like, yay, you know. Meanwhile, the camps were already up and running, you know.
There were articles in 1950 in the New York Times where there was an essay in particular where he was still trying to convince people that there was a Holocaust and there were these camps and Jews were being killed.
Right.
And this was like 1950. Because Germany had done such a good job at keeping it all in house, and people didn't believe it actually happened.
They didn't believe it, the disbelief. And I think that plays into some of it as well with the China thing. It's like, if you're telling people now, because of the relative comfort in our lives, you know, if you're trying to tell someone at the water cooler in work that there are concentration camps, and you're using that term because it's the right description, there are concentration camps in China, they're kind of like, really? You know, so, and I think that's part of, we've become so desensitized to disinformation that if you were someone with zero interest in geopolitics, but a bit of a healthy skepticism maybe about your way of thinking about the world, and someone's telling you this stuff, I imagine your first reaction would be like, nah, fake news. That's you know, or at least meeting it with a degree of skepticism. And I think that's part of the problem is
there's a diminishment in everything, isn't there? Like people call Biden a communist. People call Sam Harris a racist. People call these words racist, communist, fascist. Like Trump is a fascist. Like all of these things it's just like, so you say concentration camp and people go, yeah, but we exaggerate everything now. So I bet concentration camp is like a pretty uncomfortable place that they're kept.
A badly furbished holiday facility. Yeah.
I make 2 points on what both of you just touched on. Was firstly and this just occurred to me there actually. So part of the difficulty in making sense of this situation for so many people is, so if you think about the reality of the freedom of exchange of information and the freedom of speech and freedom of expression and the free media and the free press in the West means that when a government entity or when anyone does something bad or something bad happens or there's a corruption in a politician or whatever, it can get out there and it can snowball and we can get the information really quickly. So if you're living in the West, you're seeing all this, let's say basically corruption or police violence or George Floyd dying under the knee of a cop or whatever, this stuff spreads really quickly. Whereas there's 1.x billion people living in China, but the media control over the situation, the narrative and the internet over there means that politicians and they don't get the corrupt politicians, corrupt business owners, none of that stuff ends up in the media unless the CCP want to use the phrase corruption to justify putting someone who said something mean about Xi Jinping in prison, like they did with Ren Xinjiang when he called Xi Jinping a clown over the Wuhan virus situation. And this is another point I wanted to make actually earlier on was we can't actually, lest we forget, one of the major reasons we're in a global pandemic is because of free speech issues in China, where Dr. Li Wenliang, the late Dr. Li Wenliang, and Dr. Ai Fen, who I tried to find out what the deal was with her a couple of months ago, and there's a lot of ambiguous stuff. It seems like she's still missing.
She's disappeared, right?
Yeah, disappeared. Yeah. And they were suppressed in late December, early January. And that's why it is one of the major factors that led to this situation that we're in. So, but one last point is in relation to these terms, like you mentioned, because the terms of the Chinese Communist Party, it has that name because of, like you read in the Constitution, the roots that Mao had intellectually in Marxist-Leninism.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that, but with this kind of integration into the global capitalist system and especially in this kind of the neoliberal era where they were able to put all the factories over there and they were basically able to partake in global trade. They're now, like you mentioned also in the Constitution, the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. This thing, they're basically they have a communal structure governmentally in terms of how it is that they've put together the government. But in terms of the actual functioning of that society now, it is a fascist society.
Right.
Like the way that I'm reading a really good book at the moment and written by Mark Blythe called Angrynomics. And there's a really simple breakdown, a really simple definition of communism and fascism that's really useful. Where communism in a kind of a mile high form is where there's the suppressing or the destruction of the market, and then it's just the state and the populace. Whereas fascism is the destruction of the society and for the benefit of the market, because the society essentially what the fascism is it originates from this old Latin phrase fascis, which is essentially a hatchet with a lot of bundle of rods and twigs tied around the hatchet. And it's to symbolize the idea that the individuals gather around the state and then everything becomes really powerful then. But what's needed in a fascist society is uniformity.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the Han supremacy stuff comes in. Like the term white supremacy is tossed around all the time in our the stuff in America, but Han supremacy is also a real thing. It's also almost like this. The way we talked about it before here on this podcast was like almost like this. The rhetoric coming from the party that's driven by the Communist Party is almost like this teleological destiny that the Han have to be this really important race of people on Earth. There's like this almost like this teleological thing that's filling the God-shaped hole that was left behind by the Communist Party, basically making loyalty to a religion a very bad idea if you wanted to actually maintain your freedom. So it's essentially, it's a fascist state is what it is. And so there's
I was listening to a philosopher of Yale who wrote a book on fascism, and he wrote it recently in the light of Trump's politics. And his argument, he had a very, very nuanced take on fascism, which encompassed Hannah Arendt's idea of what totalitarianism was, and it basically built out this idea of fascism as very much reliant on a populist politics which maintains a mistrust of, or it's an undergirding racism, but it needn't be racism because he recognized that wouldn't properly encapsulate what was an Italian fascism through the sort of 1930s, and so he had to broaden that out into an ethnic xenophobia, and it was interesting in hearing him build it up and try to apply it to Trump. I was unpersuaded, but it was fascism is a term that is so heavily loaded, so thrown around, and yet so poorly understood that there's not much of a consensus on it. In as much as China's fascist in the sense that they're destroying society in regard to protecting the markets, I don't so much agree, because it was really Deng Xiaoping that brought about any consideration to building out the economy via privatization, and really, like I was saying earlier, Xi Jinping is not so comfortable with it. It's very much this forethought to Xi Jinping's ruling, and it's been carried through because it proved so beneficial. That's why Deng is called, he's called the father of modern China, I think is how people refer to him. The architect of modern China.
He opened it up in a way that gave it just enough movement away from a purely socialist model to be able to, and there's a pragmatism to this approach. Like, their goal was to lift everyone out of poverty, and that was not
a really noble goal.
Really noble goal, but that was not going to be achieved operating that just completely, essentially communist economy. So this idea of market socialism was very much Deng Xiaoping, and I think his amenable attitude to one country, two systems, this is just a thought, was based on Hong Kong's powerhouse of an economy, particularly at that time. And one reason why I think that China have been comfortable flexing muscles now, in particular Xi Jinping, I think he's happier to do it for multiple reasons. I think he's trying to assert himself, as Kieran said before, like this idea that, like, to hold on to his power, he's going to need to do something big. But here's an interesting kind of, I guess, thought experiment. China, through the 80s and 90s, was still not the economy, nowhere near the economy it is today. And Hong Kong, at the time of the handover, accounted for 20% of China's GDP. Like, Hong Kong was a quarter of the Chinese economy. And despite the fact that in the interim period,
like
Hong Kong,
7 million people or whatever, or 8 million people on the whole island, and it's
on the whole island,
versus 1 billion on the mainland, and it's
right, and it's 20% of China's GDP, and it has foreign direct investment. It's the financial hub for Asia. It's the legal hub for the region. It's a thriving economic metropolis, and so everyone kind of thought, this is why they won't touch us. This is why they'll leave us just be the second system, the special administrative region. And I think there was merit to that thinking at the time. But fast forward to now, Hong Kong's economy has doubled in the interim period, but now it accounts for only 3% of China's GDP.
Yeah, it's like a tenth of where it was.
So Hong Kong now is no more special to the CCP, to Beijing, than Shanghai or Shenzhen or Guangzhou or any of these big industrial cities in Canton or in the southeast or in Guangdong province. So that argument of they won't touch us because we're an economic, hub and powerhouse, that doesn't hold sway for them anymore. So no. I think Deng Xiaoping maybe saw Hong Kong as this will be the little kind of apple, the little pearl the jewel in our crown, that we can continue this, socialist market economy on the mainland, and we can have Hong Kong send us piles of money for because he was way more pragmatic than. And I think Xi Jinping to me is a dangerous character.
He's a complete ideologue.
He's an
really
ideologue.
In it.
Yeah. He's really an ideologue. I think he believes that he's, I guess, to use the proverb, standing on the shoulders of giants, with a position now that China has in the world due to its economic ties that his predecessors didn't have. And so they were always in the business of being a bit more cautious, a bit more open to diplomacy, although within the diplomacy, as Chris Patton always highlights, they were always bad faith actors. But I think what you have now is a situation where, I think he sees himself as having a mandate to be belligerent, not just with, let's factor in. So we were thinking about the context of these protests in Hong Kong and all of this unrest occurring in the background to all of this other stuff that's been going on in the world. But let's just think about this from China's perspective. One, you suppress the emergence of a novel virus, and I don't care what anyone says. People want to tiptoe around this issue. They took no steps to prevent that virus from spreading throughout the world.
Shut down domestic flights from Wuhan, but allowed international flights.
That's a calculated move. Yeah. There's absolutely no doubt that can be viewed in any other way.
If you're in the CCP and you want,
you can't release biological warfare, but you can. Hey, it's a virus.
Yeah.
So then there's the belligerence on the border with India. There's the issue with Hong Kong. There's continued aggression in the South China Sea and posturing towards Taiwan. There's a real upscale of the rhetoric against Taiwan.
Yeah.
There's now a complete disregard for America as any sort of power with either soft power legitimacy or even the threat of hard power, because they're too much of a mess to muster any sort of coherent kind of force response if they needed to. So the aggression in Hong Kong isn't in isolation. It's a part of a pattern of Jinping-led worldwide aggression. And there's something that we really need to be cognizant of in the duplicitousness of the way that China has responded to all of this. So we turn around and China are the ones that are turning around, pointing the finger at everyone else. And as soon as anyone started in the international community kicking up about the basic law, about the Sino-British agreement, the joint agreement, China are the one pointing back, saying, don't meddle with international treaties, don't disrespect international law. You have to respect international law, respect the basic norms of international relationships, and respect our sovereignty. And it's just like the level of absolute hypocrisy for them to conduct themselves in the world the way they do, and then point the finger at everyone else, alleging that they're not playing by the rule book.
You need only look at how they handled handled this whole virus. Was it Australia or New Zealand that basically said, so we'd like to have some sort of an investigation into what the hell happened with the coronavirus, and they were like, nope, not gonna happen. You are not going to do that. And then also as you say, we're dealing with a bad faith actor, because these are the people who basically internally just turned all of their state-sponsored news corporations over to the cause of making making as many people in China believe that America had brought over the coronavirus as possible. So that then became the message, because America were pointing the finger too much at them. So they were like, well, we're going to play a very dirty game because we could care less. And they basically just started saying, well, the US Army brought it over, and now they're trying to blame us because they're trying to destroy us, and we should hate the US even more. And then Chinese people who are already, I don't want to treat them as a block, because we've talked about the problems with this, but there is a higher proportion of racist people in China than there is in most developed nations, and they have very little tolerance of people who are different to them, such that it's already very painful trying to get a hotel if you're in any sort of ethnicity that is not Chinese. But it became extremely hostile just to be an American in China at that point. And obviously China forced the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of these big journalistic institutions to pull their journalists out of China because they wanted to become a black box. They didn't want any more transparency. So it's, as you say, they have no respect for being a player on the world stage, but then will happily monopolize on any opportunity to make other people look in some way intolerant or
and because they have these relatively kind of in the last decade, certainly last decade, maybe 20 years, these kind of newfound economic ties with so much of the world, that becomes their leverage now for, and we saw this happen with Australia. And to be fair to the Aussies, they didn't back down. They didn't back. And you got to give. There's something to be said for that Aussie spirit of there's a word for it, and I can't remember anyway. But that fuck you to authority that they're willing to kind of do, but immediately they're threatened with sanctions and trades, embargoes and stuff like that. And so
the Chinese government threatened that we're not going to buy your iron ore. They said 25 or 28 billion worth of iron ore or something. We're not going to buy that.
But all the wealthy Chinese want to have property on the Gold Coast and in Sydney. So the Aussies were just like, if you're a Chinese citizen, you can't buy property in Australia. Well, this is
the problem, isn't it? It just escalates. And also, this was signaled early 2019, or was it 2018, with the NBA and with Hollywood. Basically, they basically took control over one of the Hollywood films and said, you're not going to do that. You'll do it the way we want to do it. And then with the NBA, someone dared to speak up for Hong Kong. It would have been 2019. And
they cancelled the whole thing.
Exactly. And they lost the NBA literally lost billions.
It was one of the owners. I think it was the Houston. Anyway, I don't follow the NBA too much, but I remember reading about the story. It was a former team owner.
Yeah.
So he's not even a current. Twitter. And he basically, just posted a pro Hong Kong, pro democracy, like we're with you type tweet. And they just eviscerated the NBA from Chinese television and fucking.
Because it was under Mao. That basketball became so popular because there were very few sports you can do in enclosed spaces with not very much room indoors. And so basketball became very popular. And Mao, basically, just to keep some sort of a peace amongst the people, played American NBA games. And it became it built out this grassroots phenomenon of just this massive support for the NBA. So the NBA is massive in China.
Right.
So as soon as China go, well, okay, good luck, and they lost so much money that everyone was falling over themselves to say, we don't stand with Hong Kong, screw Hong Kong. We don't even, who cares about that place? Democracy, middle finger to democracy. It's like, you know, you have LeBron saying, oh no, I'm with China, I'm with the Chinese government. You know, it's like, it's like, come on, you're the guy who's like on court saying Black Lives Matter, but so you're an activist at heart, but you can't get behind Hong Kong.
Right. Yeah, and this is the thing, and Chris Patton talks about this in East and West, his book. It's difficult to understand why we tiptoe around China and its conduct as a state. And I'm gonna, because we're not talking about Chinese, but we're talking about the CCP, the state. Yeah. And this is a major issue. China's only recently opened its markets. It's only recently had a surge of, mainland Chinese students have swelled university ranks in the UK and in the US and otherwise. And why does China then get all of the appeasement? There are avenues open to here, like Jimmy Lai proposed, revoking the visas of mainland students and freezing assets of CCP members abroad, and all of these kind of measures that you can do. But there has to be some political appetite because there's going to be a fallout from that, right?
Well, England, Boris Johnson obviously had some sort of a nod towards we will accept a rather large amount of Hong Kong expatriates.
They're like 3 million or something.
So 3 million. So it's not even it's people who were born pre-1997.
Yeah, pre-handover.
Pre-handover.
And unfortunately, a lot of the protesters are post-handover. So.
Right. But that was good. I mean, that was basically saying that yes, if you have that joint citizenship. There's a great quote from Chris Patton. I'll just read it out verbatim. He says, "The beginning, if not quite the end, of my views on China is that we become so preoccupied with how different it is from everywhere else that we overlook the myriad similarities. We are lured into thinking that there is a special, an exact way of dealing with China, which turns out on closer inspection to be 1 part correct to 4 parts mumbo jumbo. China should be treated just like we would treat anyone else, not on the basis of voodoo or on the assumption that it requires its own rule book." And that always struck me because it's a communist authoritarian regime. I don't know why the West tends to tiptoe around the issue. Okay, it's got a significant military force, and that's obviously, you don't want to be flippant in being aggressive in diplomacy, but we fundamentally tiptoe around the issue of a belligerent power behaving completely on its own terms with complete disregard for any
increasing fashion
and getting emboldened by the ineptitude and sheer kind of inaction of the collective West.
This is the problem with having as a figurehead Donald Trump in the fight against China, because he's pretty much the most aggressive any leader has been. And the tariffs were a nonsense idea, but they were something. And unfortunately, they've harmed America as much as they've harmed China. And tariffs are always a bad idea economically. But they were a sort of a signal that, hey, look, we don't like China either. And he's the one person who on news reports consistently calls it the Chinese flu and could care less. He just always calls it the Chinese flu. And
it's so he's China.
Yeah, exactly that. But it's like, what an awful guy to have as your face for the fight against China. It's like, oh my God, this orange moron is the only person pushing back.
But because he's been the only politician who's been willing to say in public for a prolonged period what China's up to, we're not having it. Right. It then makes, because he's the only one, it then makes even conversations like this seem like...
Right, it denigrates the meaning of standing up to China because people don't want to ever be seen to be aligning to anything Trump has said, even if it makes sense. So
that's the same with me. Like, I call it the Wuhan virus specifically, and like Danny said it to me. He's like, "You're the like basically." It's like Donald Trump and Kieran are the only people who still call it the Wuhan virus. But like, that's what my reason for doing it is very different to his, I'd imagine.
The CCP flu.
Yeah, like, well, my reason for doing it, for calling it the Wuhan virus consistently, is essentially to stand in solidarity with the people, to just at least acknowledge the reality of the where it came from and why it came from that place to the extent that it did.
Right.
And of Wuhan and what they had to go through as a result of such inadequate fitness. And
this is the thing. I mean, if we yes, China is a very powerful economy right now, but it's still a socialist economy, largely with this market element now, you know, in terms of the rest of, the organization of society around this kind of market economy. And its only way of functioning is by access to the open democratic market world.
Yeah.
Because were it to rely solely on its, you know, this rosy image, like, yes, the lifting out of poverty, China has problems internally, like, and so, not to go George Kennan on resuscitating containment, but as a legitimate policy, but I think some sort of economic containment as opposed to military containment could be a really effective way of dismantling Chinese aggression. If the EU as a bloc, and it's difficult to get anything done as the EU as a bloc, but if it's, you know, if you have Europe just individually even deciding as opposed to needing the EU, and you have America and you have some of the African countries that are in the ascendancy as kind of
oh god, that's another thing we haven't touched enough upon, is the way in which
China buying Africa.
The predatory lending that
right.
in Africa, in large parts of Africa, where they know debts will go unpaid, and basically they'll be able to capture ports and continue their Belt and Road policy. And it's insidious.
Right, it's absolutely insidious. And so
economic imperialism.
Economic imperialism, and China is imperial. So, you know, we need to have effective strategies that stop them being able to buy ports in Africa, buy countries, buy land.
We don't appreciate how parasitic they are off of so many other countries. They're not standalone. They would shrivel and die in a distinct way, not entirely, but in many important ways, if they were to be cut off from much of what they need from the outside world, as you're saying. And on top of that, basically this came about largely because there was this belief that if you imbued China with an appreciation for a free market, democracy comes along for the ride. They're like synonymous. They're twins. Basically, you can't have the benefits of capitalist markets and also not have democracy. But China was like, no, we'll take that one, but why do you think that one necessarily is concomitant with this? We're good with this, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
And everyone, and people realize that too late, and now they have no idea how to necessarily
I think you're absolutely spot on with that. And I think what gave birth to that was the naivety of Western geopolitical theory in the post-Cold War period. After the fall of the Soviet Union, this fucking myth that perpetuated that, one, Ronald Reagan is the guy responsible for the end of the Cold War, you know, but two, that, you know, as your man, the American Francis Fukuyama declared, at the end of history.
At the end of history,
you know, this was going to be between the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of kind of, you know, that international pan, you know, European communism, and these independence movements, and the at the time, you know, kind of growth of neoliberalism, it hadn't fallen on its face yet, so everyone thought this was it, you know, it was the only way it was up. And so I think you had this naivety creep into foreign policy as the West pursued it, such that this assumption was then, well, well, if China are going to open up, sure, it's the end of history. There's only one way to go from here. They'll be democratic in 3 months, and not under. All you would have to do is read the preamble to the Chinese Constitution to know that was never going to happen. So I think it was
some of the ideology around the Chinese Constitution in relation to Xi Jinping I meant to pick up on earlier on. If you notice in that preamble to the Constitution, it mentioned Mao Zedong thought, and it mentioned Deng Xiaoping. And what was the Deng Xiaoping theory?
I'll go back to it here. I'll read it all out. So it starts with the guidance of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory. The theory of three represents the scientific outlook on development, and Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era.
And if you notice the way that
it's mental.
But if you think about the two that involve Mao and Deng, two of those, Xi is put his name on his theory, which basically he's put himself up there with Mao and Deng,
right?
And because he's the only out of all the people who've run the Communist Party, and then the head of the Communist Party. This is something that's worth pointing out as well. Is we've talked about this on previous discussions with James, but the head of the Communist Party basically is three roles. It's the head of the Communist Party, the president, and the head of the military. Mm-hmm. And usually it's a 2-term role. But in 2017, Xi Jinping. And the way it works historically is 5 years into this, so after your first term, you basically, if you're the president, there's only a term limit on the presidency, but not on the head of the Communist Party or the head of the military. And the way it works is that after your first term, you select a successor for your second term, because it's a 2-term limit. Mm-hmm. Well, in 2017, at the end of his first term, Xi Jinping removed the term limits on the presidency and also failed quite noticeably to select a successor from what I think is called the Council of Seven, which are the main guys that run the CCP. And in that sense, as well as that, and he also, I think he was around then, he presented also the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics, where he put himself as the only guy to put his name on his ideology, because each of the leaders of the CCP and presidents, they need to contribute something to the doctrine, basically the religious doctrine of the Communist Party. And he's the only one of the three. So he is actually setting himself up, like James used the phrase ideologue. There's a legitimate, this stuff, again, it's a different, it's this stuff is literally, it's filling the God-shaped hole in these people. He actually sees himself on some kind of destiny kind of teleology. I'm going to fucking make it happen for, he's going to, Emperor Xi kind of a thing. To even as much as some people might say that was the case with Trump and everything, you think, this narcissism and everything, the difference is there's some kind of accountability, which obviously we just had an election, right? And who knows what's going to happen with this now. That's a different discussion. But this is so dangerous because, as James mentioned, there's the insidious creep of this, where because America, you're looking at the chaos over there at the moment and the increasing division. You look at all these other crises economically that we're going under at the moment, and you're looking at China is only getting wealthier and it's only getting more bold. And it has a man at the helm that's a legitimate ideologue, bought into an ideology, grounded in this teleological ethnic supremacy stuff. That is what are we looking at in this creep, and again, an example of the institutional undermining, like you mentioned, Africa. Think about the Tedros Adhanom at the head of the WHO, basically discrediting the entire organization to a lot of people because of his essentially being in the pocket of the CCP. But the only reason he even got that job is because the CCP were able to influence votes in Africa because of their economic connections with the people within those countries. So all this voting bloc that they were able to have control over because of their economic interests in Africa, were able to put Tedros Adhanom from Ethiopia, who's actually from the Communist Party in Ethiopia, into this position that then is undermining the credibility of the entire institution. And it basically, because of this character at the helm, like the insidious nature of this is so worrying for, like, where are we in 5 years' time, 10 years' time,
right,
when China passes out America as the major superpower, and who knows what's going to happen in America in terms of social stability. Look at the way things are going, and hopefully there can be an avoidance of violence there and civil unrest in a legitimate bloodshed manner, or some kind of avoidance of insurgency stuff, which may be a more likely civil war to occur, is some kind of insurgency-based thing, if it actually does go that far in the US. Like this is the issues with China go so far. That's why it's even of interest to us. Obviously you'd live there, but it's the implications of the rise of a dictatorial
right power. We have an oppressive, autocratic, murderous, xenophobic regime with complete disdain for the rest of the world, and is snuffing out a democracy in front of our very eyes. And we seem powerless as an international community, whatever that means anymore, to do anything about it. And I think there's, again, coming back to that kind of post-Cold War point, I think there was a really good article in the FT last weekend where a guy was talking about the Cold War bizarrely had a stabilizing effect on American politics. Yeah. So even though the administration might go from Republican, the White House might go from Republican to Democrat, and they might differ in what they might do in their domestic policy agenda, but the Cold War gave them a focal point of stability. And no president was going to fuck over the incoming president with the transition plan, or was going to do anything stupid to threaten any sort of stability. So there was this continuity to a degree in terms of America's purpose as it sees it in the world. And that gave the international community of democracies and open societies a fulcrum around which to guarantee a certainty. You knew what you were getting from America abroad, even if the Republican suddenly became a Democrat that you were dealing with. And we don't have that. Post-Second War, post-Cold War, there's been wild swings from Bush Senior to Clinton, then to Bush Jr., and then to Obama. There's been some linear consistency through Clinton to Bush to Obama in terms of just illegal wars and bombing fucking brown people. But really, there's no consistency or coherence in their foreign policy. And that makes the rest of the free democratic world wonder, well, who's leading us? So then there's no coherence in the rest of what you might call NATO, or just the rest of, the international democratic community to mount any sort of response. So, I think the implications in the foreign policy arena in terms of stability, of the downfall of America, of the crumbling of the last days of Rome, as we're witnessing, this kind of decayed empire, just falling apart at the seams. I think that can't be underestimated. And I'm no rosy, just kind of pro-America at all times, hack. Like I see a lot of what America has done in foreign policy as malevolent over the years. But that aside, it's
a true
still
Chomsky fan.
Yeah, absolutely. Chomsky and Robert Reich as well. I think he's
Robert Reich, yeah, no, for sure, non-zero.
Yeah. But this idea that at least they provided a fulcrum, a kind of a consistent focal point for, and now we can't rely on that. So who do you rely on? Britain is, as John Major's great speech pointed out there recently, Britain's a second tier power globally at this point. There is no European power, militarily or otherwise. There is a huge void here that China are looking at and going, no one is going to dare tell us to stop. And that's a problem.
I need to dip out, guys.
This is a fantastic conversation.
This was incredible. This is one of my most favorite conversations I've had in a while, honestly.
We'll do a part 2.
Well,
not on the end of history, on the end of democracy. We'll just paraphrase.
I think honestly, it might be worth revisiting and talking about perhaps the loss in faith in itself of the West. That the West has very much ceded any sense that it has any value to contribute, and it's taken for granted all good that has been done since the Enlightenment movement, and because obviously you have the US who failed to live up to their own constitution for so long, but it had a constitution, and humans given responsibility to, be the ne plus ultra instantiation of any ideal, they're going to reliably disappoint. And so of course America failed to live up to its constitution, but it gets closer and closer every decade. But the fact that it wasn't perfect from the jump has given enough ammunition to those who would see America crumble, that basically it's lost faith that it was ever any good to begin with, or its ideals were worth anything.
I read a recent article from Quillette. I must be can include it in the show notes. I'll find it and send it on for the show notes. But it basically touched on this in relation to Hong Kong, and the argument that this guy was making is that us in the West, in open liberal democracies that there's a growing disdain with democracy or a lack of appreciation for what it is, and this lack of appreciation for the open waters in which we swim. And the argument he made was that Hong Kong looks like it's going down the toilet. This might have been a 2019 article. And he said countries in the West should be competing to who can get the most amount of Hong Kongers to inject into the society.
This love of democracy.
Because they're walking around holding US flags, British flags. They're holding these flags as what they idolize. And yet here we are criticizing ourselves so thoroughly, we're not even paying attention to the people who are trying to scream in our faces, appreciate what you have, and please help us retain a little bit of what you have.
I think that would be a great episode.
Cool.
We have to plan that one down.
Nice one, guys.
Excellent, guys. This is an absolute.
All right, lads. Awesome.
Really
that was great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was deadly.
Chat soon, lads.
Take care, lads.
Take care, guys. Bye.
Have a good night.